Welcome, everyone. This is Jamie Flinchball, host of People Solve Problems, and today we have a special guest, Grace Bourke. Grace, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
Well, really glad to have you on here. As a little introduction, you're consulting director for Baker Tilly. You have 40 years of experience in healthcare and quality improvement, specialize in technology implementations, places like Kaiser Permanente's Epic EHR rollout. Have an MBA from St. Mary's, a certificate in industrial engineering from Southern Cal. Serves on the board of Corvallis Housing First, a nonprofit that provides permanent supportive housing and services, which is a great cause in your own backyard. So lots of experiences, lots of interesting vectors in your life, which we'll get to explore and we get to share with our listeners today. So let me start with technology implementations, both inside and outside healthcare. Just saying the words can be scary, can create PTSD for people that have been through it many times. Lots of things can go wrong. How do you think about sort of just the problem landscape and the risk profile as you think about a technology implementation?
Thank you for that. I agree with you. I think when people hear new technologies coming, it's cringing. They don't even want to change their cell phone because they have to relearn, reestablish everything. So it can be scary, and a lot of times it's not done well. To me, it goes back to the fundamentals. Fundamentals? What problem are you trying to solve with the technology? And if you don't understand the problem, you might just be buying technology because the sales rep made it sound so wonderful. One thing I found with Sutter when we were first starting up with the EHR there was people said, "Ooh, the new EHR is going to solve this problem, and it's going to solve that problem, and it's going to solve that problem." Those problems weren't actually technology problems. They were communication, they were standard work, there was uncertainty in who does what when. And what I warned them of, and it happened somewhat, was with technology, the mistakes just happen faster
Hmm.
and are harder to find.
Yeah.
If you give me a piece of paper and there's a mistake on it, I can take it back to you and show you that, and we can work it out and get that resolved. If it's hidden in a database, sometimes people don't even know where that error crept in, and it has ramifications downstream. Having said that, I want to be very clear. I love technology, and I think it has amazing potential when it's done well.
Yeah. And in those types of conversations, are you finding that, as you talk about what is the actual problem we're trying to solve, is the end result, we don't need that technology leap, or is it more we need to solve some other problems before the technology leap?
What I found, so let me give you an example. One large healthcare provider here in the Pacific Northwest was doing an ERP implementation, re-implementation, because theirs was so far out of version that they had to kind of start fresh.
Right.
They couldn't do incremental upgrades. And as part of that, the leadership said, we want to understand what the impact's going to be. So what we did was we identified 10 critical areas. And one area they picked was recalls. So when they would get a recall notice, and these are hospitals as well as clinics, home care, etc., and it can be anything from building materials to Band-Aids. Well, the notice would go out to everybody. And then they'd run around like crazy and look, and they didn't know if they had it, didn't have it, all of that. And nobody ever really closed the loop and got back. So we looked at how they did it now and how it would work with the new technology. And we actually had people internal that could demonstrate the software, and the people could ask questions. And we did what we call a gap it. So what's the gap between how we do it now and how we're going to do it? And they identified a whole list of things. The side benefit was they also could provide input to how the software was configured because they now understood what they wanted their work to do. We found that they could improve of all the steps of the way they wanted it to be in the future. They could implement half of that now just by changing how they do the work. But they needed the technology for that other half. So it's a chicken and an egg. You got to have stable processes and you have to have technology that supports those stable processes.
Yeah. And let me ask about that process as it relates to buy-in then. In this case, for example, buy-in wasn't about whether we should go forward or not because there was we have to, right? This system is too old and we have to move. So it doesn't even matter if it's better. It's going to happen.
Yes.
But you still want buy-in in order to make it work, right? So they may not be buy-in to the actual decision, but buy-in to make it work. Um, are there is that participation and involvement the key to that buy-in, or are there other things that you adopt to try to engage people and get them bought into the transition?
I think it's a big part of it, but not everybody can be in those groups. So they need to be ambassadors representing their teams and taking information back. And there still needs to be a change management plan. People need to hear from very high leadership of the vision and the why. And let's be clear, a lot of engagement goes to the why. Do I understand why this change is being made? Do I understand why it's going to be set up this way? And then some information needs to come from the people closer to the staff. If you're going to significantly change my job description, and that did come up at CPMC, they had one group that did this piece of work and one group that did that piece of work, and they wanted to merge them. Well, San Francisco's union, you have to go through the union for that. Once they understood the why, and then the benefit both to them and to the patients that they're serving, that helps. But that kind of information that directly impacts me, my work, my salary, has to come from somebody close to me that I know and trust.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's talk about problem solving as it wraps around the actual technology implementation. Kind of one of the adages that create that PTSD is that the technology implementation is going to be behind schedule and over budget, and then once it's enough over budget, we abandon half of the features and we don't get all the things we were promised anyway. So that's how some people end up experiencing it, which means we have to prevent that, right? And so how do you think about we had a good plan or we had at least good intentions? How do we prevent problems, solve problems, avoid problems as we get into launching and executing technology implementations?
Ideally, we do this gap it beforehand. And what would come out of these gap it workshops is a list of gaps. But they were also, we applied the failure mode effect analysis. What's the probability of it going to happen? What's the impact if it happens? And is this impact to just one person, one role, a facility, or is this something that's systemic? So, for example, we'd come out of that, out of a workshop with 100 items. Now, we're not going to build a project plan that way. We would group them and go, you know what, these 6 can all be just do it's. And so is going to own this one, so owns that one. We're just going to get them done. These are workshops, into Kaizen workshops where people would actually design the new work. And that's one way to head that off. I think that part of why things go over budget, over time, and don't meet the needs is because so many people don't understand how their work actually happens. And so there's all this swirling as the people you can never use technology right out of the box, right? You get a brand new cell phone, you got to configure it. You got to put in your contact list, that type of thing. Well, If they put in somebody else's contact list, that doesn't help. And that's what happens with technology implementations if we don't think about it in advance.
Mhm.
Fortunately, cell phones get updated so often that most of the carriers have it pretty dialed in that they can download it from the cloud.
Yep.
But the early days, that was really manual.
Mhm. Yeah, I still, I'll call paper technology. I once lost my Franklin planner with all my content
Oh,
in it, and yeah, it can be quite devastating. That goes back quite a ways now. But so FMEA, failure mode effect analysis, one of my favorite tools that's rarely used. um, and I even see people trying to invent new versions of it. The pre-mortem is popular now to imagine how things might fail before they fail. And part of me says, well, where do you're just reinventing something that already exists. One of the benefits of FMEA, but I think also one of the barriers is the rigor and the details that the FME sort of requires. So in using FMEA, how do you find the right balance of depth? How do you find the right balance of engagement? Um, how do you make sure the rigor is there and it's not just a sort of pencil whipping exercise? How do you make that live?
so we actually made it very specific for healthcare and translated it to terms that they would understand. And then we made it a half-page card, basically. And we had them fill it out. And I'm going to be honest, at first, some of them were pretty vague. and some of them I couldn't even read the writing. So what we leveled ourselves up, improved it. We had whoever wrote it had to pass it to somebody else. And that person had to read it, and everybody had to confirm they understood what it was and that they agreed with that ranking. And it became really quick. It was a cadence. It was not a big, long backstory.
Mhm.
They could only read what was on the card, and the card had to stand alone.
That's great. I love that sort of quick validation because especially when there's a room, everybody can just defer to the person who wrote it. But this idea of no, your job is to validate that this makes sense. Very, very specific responsibility in the conversation that I can't delegate to the room because you've given me this card and asked me to validate and understand it. So that's it's a very specific procedure that I could see exactly why that works well.
And having it be public helped everybody learn. And I joke and I would tell them, I'm a really tough grader. And they appreciated that. And they said, you know what? I got better because of that. I grew as a person and as a professional. Somebody texted me once. It's a text I'll always remember. She said, you helped me find my voice and you helped me be a better person. Thank you. Because they learned it was okay to not be perfect, and they all got to read something that was safe and were able to speak in front of people and stand up for what they thought was right. Too often, we take agency away from people.
Mhm.
The old command and control assumed that a few people had knowledge, authority, power, and everybody else had no agency and would just follow. You can't solve problems with just a few people. That's part of Toyota's secret sauce is every single person was a problem spotter and a problem solver. They had agency.
Let me ask about that agency because that's a big deal. And that quote you shared, I bet you'll carry that around with you forever. Those things live in our brains and echo on. Um, but sort of a hypothesis I want you or an assumption that I want you to both validate, but then also help me overcome is in healthcare that agency problem is worse than average. And with technology implementation, that agency problem is also worse than average because of the risk and the scope and the scale involved. So first, are those things generally true? And if so, how do we beyond those moments, how do we more wholesale overcome that agency problem in healthcare and in technology implementations?
Yeah. Yes, healthcare is more hierarchical, which by its nature means agency. And I had hoped that, I'm old school because I've been in healthcare for a very long time. I was hoping that as we got the younger generation, they weren't getting as programmed. Unfortunately, it's going to take a whole lot more people retiring for that to actually shift. And I saw that last week where a provider was saying a provider um, was more important than a nurse practitioner. I was like, ouch, that's a
Mhm.
very capable nurse practitioner. And that really hurt that person and shut them down.
Yeah.
So I do think it is very counterproductive to take agency away from people. I think what needs to happen is it needs to be clear what their scope of agency is. We were also working with people on the front desk, patient registration, and now they're realizing they have agency within boundaries, but they're blossoming with that. We just have to support them in that practice because the docs still want to override the standard work and go around.
Yeah.
So it does take leadership, holding people accountable and supporting staff.
Yeah.
So I think clarity helps.
I love that. And certainly just give me some hope we can make more progress there as well, as we move forward, even if it's a lot slower than we'd like to see. Um, Coming back to the FMEA, right? You end up with this big inventory of problems or potential problems, right? They're unrealized at this point. Um, how much does that, I'll say, threaten the scope, the cost, the timeline of the initial project and what people imagined it would be, and how much of it is, awareness is half the battle, right? So does it actually start to paint a picture around, no, this is going to take twice as long for these reasons, but let's get ahead of it now? Or are they simply, now we know and we can solve these problems as we move?
Well, with our gap it approach, we work through them. Some of them, we say, you know what? We're going to accept that risk. Like any other FMEA, it's the impact's going to be minor, or we don't think it's going to happen, or both, preferably. So we would take that list and actually come up with a plan to resolve them. And we would just do it, Kaizen workshops, policy decisions, configuration choices, and shepherd those through a standard issue log approach of project management.
Hmm.
I'm not only certified in Lean, but also project management. So I blend both approaches. I have seen, there was one group I was working with that was implementing AI to handle incoming calls for scheduling. And as I went through and designed the test plan, it became very apparent that they had significant risks because these certain functionality hadn't been thought through fully. So we weren't doing the GAPIT approach on that. We were just doing a support for implementation. They did need to scale down to what I know as minimum viable product. And you have to make choices. This is essential. This can be phase two, and that one we may wait.
Yeah.
And for me, I was taught safety, quality, delivery, cost. That's the priorities. We don't hurt our patients
Hmm.
or our staff. We make quality is the priority, and then the timeliness.
That's that would be a great way to end. We are almost at time, but I do think that prioritization around risk is super important, and that's very cleanly articulated. I do want to ask though. We talked about FMEA, and it's like what I like to call a lean adopted tool, right? It wasn't born out of lean efforts, but it's very lean adjacent or lean consistent. Are there other lean tools that you found have worked or lean methods that have been very effective throughout either in planning or building or implementing the technology implementation?
So let me clarify, lean tools that have been helpful,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
I do think, oh, well, this one's a little bit lean adjacent that we implemented in with the GAP-IT, which is not typically lean. It's SIPOC, suppliers, input, process, output, customer. And we were using that as a way to understand this. Out of all the work that they do, we're just going to talk about this piece because they found it very difficult to not go off on tangents and want to solve every problem.
right.
So by identifying this is the first step, this is the last step, and this is what we're talking about, it helped people stay focused. And then, of course, we used a very basic swim lane.
Yeah, and as you said, those aren't born out of lean, but they, if lean, the fundamental first principle is understand the work. They help do that, and I always found SIPOC very, very useful for a bunch of reasons, but specifically, do we even have the right people in the room?
Yes, because if you start with that, and that's one of the things we would do, hopefully as a prep step, but not always. Sometimes it would be at the start of the workshop. Then we could adjust and say, okay, who do we need to have in the room? And can we get them, we could adjust it because there's no point in doing a week-long workshop with the wrong people in the room.
Yep, it's really discouraging when you either know you're headed into that or you come out of it finding out what you were missing. Um,
Yes.
I think one of the failure modes of doing the work to prevent the failure modes. So thanks for sharing that perspective on this work. So I really thank you on sharing your perspectives and your practical experience at these transformations. And Grace, I really wish you and I'll say the Baker Tilly team, but also all of your clients, all the very best.
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
You as well.